using your two rests, but as long as you know how to adhere again, I'm going to cut right to the thickness of the wall here. Alright, welcome. So today is going to be a video about how to do a very basic bowl. And here you see our setup. I've just put on the shim. We'll be using a bowl blank about 2 inches, just over 2 inches. So this is quite a small bowl blank, and it's already been pre-drilled. And it's going to be a very good exercise for people who are learning. If you're learning how to turn bowls, I would advise you to start with a bowl about this size. So about just under 150 mm and about 2 inches. Okay. And the reason for working with small bowls when you first start out is because the commitment is a bit lower and you get to learn the same things throughout the entire process, even if it's such a small bowl, right? Because every bowl needs a foot and every bowl will need hollowing and centering and all those things. So if you practice on a small bowl, you will use less material, less time, less tooling, less wear and tear on your blades, and also less energy, less electricity. Okay, so yep, highly recommend doing a small bowl. So just gonna do the setup now. So I will be discussing everything from two rest setup as I'm going. I'm trying to do my best to talk and work at the same time. And this is actually a very small lathe. It's only about, I think it's about 900 watts, less than 1 kilowatt. Okay, so really small lathe. And this hopefully will inspire you guys to give turning a shot at home even. We're not going to be using many different tools. Okay, so you see I have my bowl gouge here, and this is the only gouge that we'll be using for today's class. Okay. Alright, so I got everything mounted up. Hopefully the audio records well. So yes, we have our tailstock here, as you can see in the video. And make sure to mount your tailstock rather firmly and to lock your tailstock so it doesn't come loose during the process. Always do a manual turn of the lathe, of the item, the stock, before you begin, because it might be off-centered very significantly, it might be loose. Okay, so make sure it's nice and approximately centered before you even start. Okay, gonna power on now. So we are going to be turning at a very high RPM today. It's about 1600. So that is considered moderately high RPM for wood turning. There are two reasons for utilizing high RPM. One of it is just the raw speed that you can get out from the turning, and also the finished quality. So right now what I'm doing is I'm centering the bowl stock, and as you can see I'm using kind of like a skew cut, and now we are already approximately centered. So when you're centering your stock, it's always a bit deceptive at the start because of the fact that your work might not be round, even though it looks round when it's spinning. So you sometimes, as a beginner, you have to slow down the lathe just to make sure that everything is centered. Okay, but now you just got to trust me on this. And you can see I'm actually turning out the shape of the bowl right away. And we're making a bowl that is kind of like a rice bowl shape. So it's not going to be, it's going to have very normal looking, round looking walls. Okay, I'm going to just adjust my two rests slightly. As you approach the foot area, I will transition to a pivot cut like this. And this will prevent me from bopping out at the end. Okay, I'm going to show you what that means. So if you try and follow the cut through normally, you might just bop out like that. You see that little bop, okay? So that's a bit of a loss of control, so you want to try as much as possible to avoid that when you are reaching the end. So what I would usually do, I will cut right to the end there, and I will stop, and I will transition my cut. I'm going to adjust my tool rest again. So of course, if you're starting out and you're not very comfortable with a lathe, I do recommend that you stop the machine before adjusting your tool rest. But as long as you know how to adjust your tool rest properly, it should be quite predictable and there should be nothing wrong with it's totally fine and safe to adjust it when your machine is still running. So we're preparing the foot now, and you can see the foot is already appearing. On this lathe, we are looking for a diameter of about 7-8 mm. So this foot has to be made to fit the jaw. Where possible, you want it to be as large as your chuck jaws can hold. And this way, you can get the maximum strength of the foot when you turn it around. Okay? So you can see that I'm using a couple of different cuts here. And at the beginning, what we have done is just to do a skew cut and then gouging down. So I'm actually taking a short video of the foot sizes, hence why I'm stopping. Okay, sorry, back to the point. Okay, so now I'm going to use the tip of my gouge and just cut in like that. Okay, so back to the topic about different kinds of cuts. The foot can be prepared in different ways, but usually as I get closer to the size, I'm going to do almost like a scrape cut. So I'm going to close my foot almost completely here and just close it down, so that it's safer and we don't risk tearing the foot out during the process. Okay, right behind the bowl, I will show on the video later, there is your actual jaw, which has the same shape as the dovetail that you need to create for your bowl. So I'm actually just viewing beside here on the left and using that as a sort of a reference for the actual shape of my foot. Okay, so you want to keep your foot as large as possible in terms of the diameter, and in terms of the height, it has to be the exact same height as your the jaws. And the reason for that is that if your jaws, if it's taller than your jaws, you won't be able to reference the bottom of the bowl, and if it's shorter than your jaw, then you wouldn't be able to reference the bottom of the foot. Okay, I might do a separate video to cover this in more detail, but right now what I'm trying to do is just make sure that this foot is the same height as the jaws, which are hidden behind the bowl from your angle. Okay, so my foot is kind of ready, and I'm going to begin the final scrape. I'm going to change to a left hand stance here. So there are many ways that you can finish the bowl. I'm going to show you now a scrape cut. So we're using the bowl gouge as a scraper. And now I'm going to demonstrate a skew. So a skew cut will give you a much cleaner finish. However, it's not the easiest cut to do, depending on the shape. Okay, so I'm going to do a combination of both because I'm not super comfortable turning left-handed. Okay. So you really want to spend some time to work on the curvatures of your bowl at this stage, because any kind of irregularities in your turning in the shape of the bowl is going to show up as a kind of a hard thing to sand away later. So you definitely don't want to go too easy on the accuracy of your curve, and don't expect to be able to sand out some of the very major defects along the wing. Okay, so right now the bowl is really looking like a bowl shape, and my foot is about just slightly taller than it should be. And I'm now going to remove the tailstock. Okay. So by removing the tailstock, you can see because we are mounted on the screw center, it's not going to change anything in terms of the stability when it's still running. But of course, once you start gouging, it does become less stable if you ever catch or anything like that. So while it is possible to turn this without the tailstock at the start, I will not recommend it, especially if you're just starting out. Okay. Okay, so we're going to cut right into the center there. So I have to emphasize that there are many different ways to turning a bowl, and this is just one of the ways. Okay, and I'm going to a little bit rough there. So what we're gonna do, I'm gonna try not to block the camera here. Okay, but we're gonna cut a little recess right into the center there. And this recess is gonna be a little bit deeper than normal because I want to use this bowl to demonstrate a kind of bowl which is called like a small foot bowl. A bowl with a very tiny foot, or in some situations a footless bowl. Okay, so a very deep recess like that is going to prepare the live center to center on a very deep part of the foot. That way we can remove a large part of the foot later on. Okay, so that's the foot already done, and going to recenter the tailstock. So this recentering is not required at this stage in terms of the turning, but it is actually just to give you a reference for the next stage of your work when you do the jam chucking. So this is just to touch and create a center hole. We're not actually going to be doing any turning here at all. Okay, and I am finally going to turn the lathe off, and hopefully there aren't any very major defects that I did not catch earlier on. Okay. Okay, so you can see the bowl is quite nice, quite smooth, nothing really problematic with it. And I have particularly selected this stock because it has rather major cracks on the body. So you can see a lot of cracks through the foot even, and on the side of the walls here. So I'm going to use this to do a quick demonstration of how to seal your bowl and how to just solidify everything. Okay, so this is super glue. This is 502. It's a cyanoacrylate super glue. It's very common super glue, but it is a special formulation known as 502. So make sure you buy the right one if you're using it for turning or just wood repair work in general, because you need something that is extremely liquid so that it will flow inside. Okay, so the reason for choosing this very terrible looking stock, right, is because I want to show how the turning, it doesn't really, other than the gluing, it doesn't really affect much of your work when you are turning something like this. Okay, so there's no reason to avoid crack stock unless it's for aesthetic purpose. I personally like it a lot. I find that it's kind of low cost and prevents me from having to throw away half of my wood. So when you're preparing bowl stock, especially if you're using green stock like this, you'll find that you're gonna get a lot of cracks throughout the process of the drying. So can be quite wasteful if you always have to throw the stock away. So there's one small thing I want to point out. Now that we have stopped the lathe, right, you can see that there are some areas here that are still actually not properly faced off. So this technique, this procedure is called facing the foot. And facing the foot is going to be very critical for your referencing. So if you see a little bit of marks like that, right, please take the time to just clean it up, because you want the face to be perfectly flat, okay? So make sure your glue is partially dry before you turn on the machine. If not, the glue might just spill all over your face. You're gonna turn it on now. So I'm just gonna very lightly face the foot one more time. Just one more time here. Okay, stop the lathe to have a look. Okay, very clean, flat bottom. Now we can begin the actual work. Okay, but of course in the process I found that I've shortened my foot a little bit, so I'm going to just deepen my foot more. And thankfully we do need to turn on the lathe again because of the super glue and the sawing, the sawdust. So perfect opportunity. Okay, so I'm just going to deepen the foot very, very slightly. And maybe make it just a tiny bit smaller in diameter. Okay, so hopefully I've cleared up all of the areas where there was a large amount of glue. Okay, so we're gonna do a bit more sanding, but I also see that there is some spots where the gluing is not completed. So I'm just gonna sand it a little bit and force some of the dust inside. Okay, so just a bit of light sanding and then super glue in the sawdust. And hopefully that wasn't too much glue that I put on, to the extent that we have to re-gouge the bowl. So I'm just going to trust that that's enough. I'm just going to sand it directly. So this is 80 grit. So you can use an orbital sander for this, and we often use an orbital sander in class. Orbital sanders would have a combination of both the rotary and the orbital action. So, but if your gouging is clean enough, you wouldn't need that as much. Okay, but orbitals will prevent you from leaving all these spinning rotary trails, so your bowl will look a lot less stripy. But that's of course only if your gouge technique is not clean enough. Okay, if you are experienced and you do get a good, generally a good, you do get good gouge action going, you'll find that you might not need to do any orbital sanding other than maybe to speed things up. Okay? So I'm going to skip that here. I'm going to do a regular sanding. Yeah, of course if you just do a slight motion, a little rocking motion like this, it does help to remove some of the trails. And make sure that your sanding is always done on the bottom, don't do on the top, so that you won't get your hands caught and your fingers folded back. Okay, so always have your sanding done away from you. If you're doing this at home, at this point you definitely should get a vacuum and just put it nearby so the dust goes in. The saw chips are, the turning chips are much easier to remove by sweeping, but the dust is going to be a killer if you're doing this at home. Okay, so sanding the inside just to remove some of the glue. Make sure your little hole is still there. Okay. Alright, okay, so stop the machine for a short while we check the finish. Okay, we're gonna go for 120 and then after that 400. Then under 240 after that, and then we're gonna burnish it with beeswax. So if you, I'm not sure if you can see on the camera, but there's like a little bit of stripiness in the material because of the rotary motion. So I'm gonna try to eliminate that by sanding finer and finer, going up. So while I'm sanding, I'm gonna try and explain a couple of things here. So first of all, the foot that you see at this stage of your work is what I would describe as your functional foot, okay, your structural foot, which means that it's the foot that is designed to be held on by the chuck in the next stage of your work. Okay, the foot shape here is kind of universal. You don't really have a choice on approximately the size of the foot that you have at this stage because it matches kind of the size of your jaws, the chuck jaws. Okay, so if you have a 4-inch chuck, you're going to have a 4-inch appropriate foot, which is just under about 3 inches. And it's a very common thing for beginners to have the confusion about this at this stage, because they would look at the foot here and say that, oh, I want a nicer foot, I want a smaller foot. That is actually done in the second stage of the work, in what I would describe as your aesthetic foot, okay, or your visual foot. So pay attention to this shape, that this foot shape has to be produced even if you ultimately intend to have no foot at all on your bow. Okay, because this foot is purely structural. It is for you to hold on to during your gouging and opening of the thing. Okay, so as you can see, sanding is rather time consuming. It takes a lot longer to sand than to actually remove the main gouging, but it does give you a very good finish. However, if you are puristic, or if you are in a rush, or you're making something for a friend that you kind of just want to get a quick one out, then you can try to skip the sanding and try and rely on just purely using your gouge to create a good effect on the work. Okay? And of course burnishing, which is a step that I will not skip, the burnishing itself. Okay, that was 120 and now we're going for 240. So the difference between a bow that's sanded and a bow that is not sanded could be, say, twice the amount of time. So it can be quite a time saving if you just skip this step and focus more on the gouging technique. Okay, so ultimately it depends on what you're trying to do, but I would say that sanding is a lot easier than the gouging. So if you are practicing, I would advise you to skip the sanding once you get the idea of it, and just really work on the gouging, and only do fine finishing when you are really trying to make something that is a showpiece. Okay, because the gouging is going to take a lot more time to work on. It's a skill that develops slower than sanding. Okay, sanding is, I'm literally just pushing on here, right? Okay. Of course, there are people who are expert finishers and they will say very different thing. Maybe people who do lacquerware, who prepare their surfaces very well. Okay. So I'm not even going to stop the lathe. I'm just going to burnish it directly. So of course, you don't really have to burnish it at this point, but I would prefer to do that because it saves me some time, and it also gives me a lot more strength in the item that allows me to push a lot harder on the thing. Okay, the harder you can push in general, the stronger you can do something is usually better, because then you have less chances of making a mistake, and you can really get the kind of finish that you want. So that rubbery thing that I just put on, right, this thing here is beeswax, just a piece of all natural beeswax. You can use paste wax, you can use any kind of hard burnishing wax. There are specific waxes that people use for turning, formulated with certain polishing compounds even. Okay, so this is just raw beeswax, and of course it's something that I would recommend that you use for the fact that firstly it is food safe, so it is extremely it's also very easy to find. If you buy it in pellet form, you can just boil it and cast it into a small block before using it. Okay, so I totally got carried away there and started burnishing the foot and waxing the foot, but actually it's completely unnecessary because we are going to be cutting the foot away later. So just focus on the body at this stage, which is actually the most important part, because after you're done gouging the bowl, you're going to find that the bowl will be very thin and you can't really do very hard burnishing like I'm doing now. I'm really pushing on it. Just be careful your fingers. And this is just a cotton rag, nothing special here. Okay, don't be tricked by this shininess that you see when you put on the liquid melted beeswax, because the fact that it's liquid is going to make it look a lot shinier. Burnishing is ultimately what makes it shiny. And always move your fingers like that so you won't leave deep scratches, any kind of circular scratches. Okay, so I'm going to just do a very simple job here. I'm going to stop right now and have a look at the finish. If you do see any defects at this stage, of course, definitely stop and correct them, even to the point of re-gouging. Okay. Because once you take it off, you won't be able to do much correction. Okay, so I'm gonna pull the bowl out now. So this is just a screw chuck, just turn it out by hand. Okay, so I'm gonna try and do a quick preview here. Okay, so you can kind of see nice and smooth, shiny finish there. Okay, so that's unchuck. So okay, so there was a bit of a clip off in the camera, so now we're going to continue. And as you can see, I have already removed the bowl. Now we're going to chuck it on. So when you are chucking your bowl, you want to make sure that your bowl is, you're holding on right in the center of the bowl, like this. Okay. This will help you to register very flat across the bottom. Okay. In fact, I'm going to take a video of, so here's a little close-up shot on my iPhone. And you can see how the floor of the foot has to be directly centered to flat against the bottom. So if your foot is shorter than the jaws, you're not going to be able to do that. Okay, so this is a very important skill for beginners, how to flatten your foot and to center your bowl properly. Yep, so hopefully this is round. I'm going to do a quick dab. Okay, and it doesn't look like it's fully flat, so I'm just going to rotate it a little bit and try and chuck this on again. Okay, so one of the best ways to test your centeredness is just to put your, you can use any hard object I guess, but I like to use the chuck key. And you can see we're having a little bit of a bobby thing here, which is not exactly the best. Okay, but I'm gonna try one last time to center this, and if not, I'm just gonna move on. So your foot's gonna get all chewed up from being chucked on like this. So there's absolutely no need to Okay, it's not really improving much, so I'm just gonna take it as that's being the best. I might have made a small mistake when I was doing the sanding. Okay, doesn't matter. So, I'm gonna remove the tailstock because you don't need that, and it's gonna get in the way. So we're gonna start gouging now. So gouging is kind of like everything else in turning. There's always two directions you can go in. So I'm gonna demonstrate outside in and then inside out. I'm gonna try both. Okay. So the key point about setting up your tool rest position, because of the thickness of your gouge, you want to make sure that your tool rest is just slightly below center. Okay, about the thickness of the gouge below the center will be just nice for you. Okay, if you put it right on center, you're going to find your gouge is going to be right in the air like that. Okay, so we're going to start gouging now. Oops. Tool rest was not actually locked. So this is the outside in method. Okay, and you're basically just cutting a groove and then bringing the island smaller and smaller from there. I'm gonna go inside out now. Oops. Hold on a moment. There's something wrong with my tool rest here, which is somehow not tightening very well. Alright, okay, now we're in. Okay. Okay, so this is a little bit quieter and a bit smoother. You can see these very long ribbons. Okay, when you're turning, you always know that your technique is okay and goodish if the chips are coming out efficiently and fast. Okay, so if you see long stringy chips like this, they look like ribbons. That's always an indicator that your technique is okay. Okay. If you see very powdery chips, or if you hear a lot of noise and a lot of friction, then you know that you're not doing so well. Okay. So I feel like the angle, I'm gonna have to change the camera angle because I can't really, it's kind of blocking a little bit. So I'm just gonna move my camera now to a slightly more frontal view. So just now as you were talking, right, I was going inside out like this. And as the curvature of the bowl changes, you're going to find that becomes more and more difficult, especially if you have your a long bit like we have on this lathe, which is not going to allow your it's not going to allow your long gouge to go very far below. So now as we go further into this direction, I'm going to change into outside in again. I'm going to cut right to the thickness of the wall here. And I'm going to be making the decisions mostly based on ergonomics and also the noise. If the process is very loud and noisy, then I'm going to assume that that's going to be not very efficient. Okay, the tool rest needs to be adjusted one more time here because it is getting a little bit hyperextended. So you have to make sure that your tool rest is supporting your tool properly throughout the entire process. So today is a bit finicky because this lathe that I brought out for filming has a funky tool rest. Okay, so back to the point. So this is one of my favorite ways of gouging, and basically you start with a point going in like this, and as you follow the curvature of the wall, your tool actually does not change in orientation, but because of the relationship of the tool to the walls and the floor of the bowl, the cut is actually changing very drastically. Okay, one more time. So tool angle stays the same, but because of the change in orientation, you will see a very drastic change in the tool angle with respect to the surface that you're cutting. Okay, so that was the initial rough gouging, and I'm going to just stop the bowl to just do a quick check on the thickness of the walls. The most common thing is that you would thin out the bottom of your bowl and detach the foot from the bowl itself. Okay. So now we're going to go from the floor and to the walls, floors up to the wall now. And I'm going to go in the reverse orientation. So this is what I call a safety cut. Closing the flute almost completely and just kind of scraping the walls. This gives you the lowest chance of catching on the rim of your bowl. So if you are going to catch with any other cut, right, this is what's going to prevent you from losing your bowl at the last moment. Okay? So take note that my flute is completely closed almost, leaving just a tiny gap so that chips can eject. I'm essentially just scraping the bowl here using the gouge as a scraper. And this will allow you to thin down your walls very predictably, even with cracks inside your bowl. Speaking of cracks, if you recall, we do have quite significant cracking on this bowl. So we are going to take a pause and do some sanding. No, not some sanding, some gluing. Okay, so I'm going to glue some of the cracks here. Of course, you don't want to be gluing any earlier than this because you need the bowl to be rather thin in order for the glue to reach where you want it to go. Okay, so if you try and flood the bowl much earlier on with a lot of glue, it's going to be a waste of time because the glue can't exactly travel inside the wall, and then after that everything's still going to burst open when you actually get to the thin wall kind of area. Okay, so hopefully this video will give you some confidence, this demonstration will give you some confidence to work with cracked bowls and just to kind of enjoy the experience of working with sub-quality wood, which is absolutely the best way to improve your technique. Okay, because if your technique is very heavy, you can't really work with very thin material, very brittle and cracked out materials. If you're going to require very strong material, then the technique will be very blunt and very coarse. Okay. So the thinner your material, the thinner your bowl is, the higher the stakes are. So you do want to become less and less risky towards the end of your process. Okay, if you want to be brave at the start of the process, not now. Okay, now is the time to be cautious. Okay, so I'm trying to make sure that the sort of the ankle of the bowl is thin enough, and also that it connects well between the top and bottom. So this is going to take you a little bit of time and control and a bit of patience. So you can see I've done a cheat edge where the edge is really very thin compared to the walls. It's a bit of a roll off. But if you cheat your edge, it's just for a visual reference, but it's just for a visual effect. But if you do end up with a thick ankle or bottom of your bow, right, it's gonna feel quite uncomfortable when you're using it as an actual bow. Okay, and of course it's gonna feel very rough and lacking in finesse. So please take time to work on the interior of your bow, especially in connecting them properly. Okay, so I am fueling the bow with the machine on, which is a little bit dangerous. So if you are just starting out, please exercise a lot of caution when you're doing this, especially at 1600 RPM, which can be quite hot just due to the friction alone. Okay, I'm trying to get a sense of it. Okay, so my wall thickness is okay now. I'm just going to try and connect the floor now. Your gouge is going to have to be a bit more extended. You want to make sure that your gouge, you try and gouge out as much as possible to connect the floor and the walls. If you do too much of if you do a very rough one and try and sand it out, it's really going to take a lot more time, and ultimately it will corner you into a very bad technique in the long run. Okay, so right now if you feel like a little ridge there, take your time in the practice to try and clear that little detail there out. Of course, if you have a scraper, at this point it's going to be a very helpful tool for you to use a little half round scraper to cut this. But part of this demonstration is sort of I guess a minimalistic demonstration where I'm going to show you how you don't really need that many tools to do this. Okay, the connection is okay-ish now. I'm just going to go for the other direction of a scrape just to flatten the floor. Okay, and my tool rest needs to go higher slightly. Alright. Okay, I feel a little bump there. So unless you're in a rush, like you literally have to finish the bowl somehow, never shy away from trying to be geometrically perfect with your gouge, because that is pretty much the whole point of turning. Okay, if you intended to have flat walls, make sure you have flat walls. If not, what's the point of practice? Yep. So this is also why small bowls are very good for practice. Because no matter how big the bowl is and how small the bowl is, the process of flattening the floor and connecting the walls and the floor is always very similar. Creating the radius, fueling the radius. are all about the same. So there's no real need to dig through 10 inches of material just to practice this one little flaw, because this is very where the detail comes. The initial gouging, the initial removal of material is not as technical as this portion here. And of course, if you get good at this, you're gonna get good at that also. Okay? So bear with my pace because the angle is a little bit awkward for me here, trying to avoid the camera. Okay, I'm almost done there. I'm gonna upload this in real time just so that you guys can see how sometimes it's not very predictable. Okay, good. So I'm all set now. I feel approximately flat. The only thing that is a little bit weird is just the sanding. Not the sanding, the texture. I still feel some striations from my gouge. Of course, if you have a scraper, that's not going to be a problem. So we're going to use sand with 80 grit now to remove those scratches. And at the same time, I'm going to use a piece of, because this is kind of getting a little bit on the thin side, I'm going to use my original burnishing cloth, just support the thing, and I'm kind of just squeezing both sides together, just to produce a very slight, kind of more of a supported sanding, okay, allowing me to go a lot faster. So as with all sanding, the 80 grit sanding is always the most important. The initial heavy sanding is the most important. The finer grits are not anywhere near as crucial. So always spend all your time doing your initial sanding and never cut any corners when you're doing initial sanding, because you'll always regret that further down the way. Okay? If you only have time 10 minutes of sanding, spend all 10 minutes sanding on 80 grit. Okay, no point going to a higher grit if your first course grit is not properly set up. So obviously, for the interior of the walls, you can't use the orbital sander, so you have to rely very much on just hand sanding, hand pressing like that. Okay, but of course this is already very high RPM rotary sanding, so this is not anywhere near as time consuming as fully hand sanding. Okay, almost done there. So you will notice that in turning, that the center of the bowl or center of anything that you're turning is always a lot slower, and the RPM gets a lot higher. On the surface speed gets a lot higher. The RPM actually stays the same. Okay, so the middle of the bowl is going to be the hardest to sand. So you do want to spend a lot more time in the middle. Okay, and kind of just move outwards occasionally, and just keep mashing out the center. So you move out. Okay, and removing my hand here, please don't cut your hand on the rims. You're just trying to feel for any scratches, any kind of rotary scratches, any tool marks that remain. Of course, you try not to turn on the lathe and turn off the lathe too much at this point. It's going to be a waste of belt damage, and also a waste of time to wait for the lathe to slow down. And I just transitioned to a 120 here. It's 120 grit, and that's going to be just a quick touch. Okay, I'm not even going to spend too much time so that you won't get bored watching this. That was 120, and now this is 240. Okay, trust me that the 80 was the most important one. Well, of course the gouging is the most important one, but after rough gouging, you're going to clear out a lot of dirt with your 80 grit sanding. Okay, this is now 240. We're going to spend a lot of time in the center. Make sure the center is nice and polished. Now, beeswax, which I've dropped on the floor. Okay, so you can see putting the wax in the middle does take a bit of time, but the moment you get it out here, it's going to be a lot faster, simply because the heat is going to melt the wax much faster than on the outside. Okay, don't be too concerned about even waxing, because you're going to be burnishing it, any excess wax would flow onto your cloth. Okay, waxing again. Get it hot. So I'll use the outside to get it hot, and then I'll bring it in the middle so that the wax would flow better when right in the center where it's slower. Forgot to just kind of dial down the rim a little bit. So the wax goes back on. Remember to use the pinching, especially if you're going to be doing very thin items. You do want to use the pinch technique, squeezing technique, rather than a direct press in case you break the walls. Alright, hopefully that was enough. Which it is. Okay, very good. I'm going to just touch up the wax on the exterior because we might have just damaged it a little bit. Get a bit of wax on the sides. Alright. Okay, so the frontal angle seems to be a little bit easier to show most of the interior details. So I'm going to just stay there. Let me get the chuck open. Okay. So you can see this is already kind of like bowlish, clean, good enough to use. Interior is rather smooth. But on the edge here, on the foot here, we see a lot of the chuck marks that was applied due to the chucking. So we're going to grab a gem chuck to flip it around with. Okay, I'm going to be right back. Okay, so gem chuck. So this little thing here is called a gem chuck. It's obviously made something you can make yourself on the lathe. It's just a little nubby thing that you grip onto. Okay, you just vice chuck on here, and that allows you to hold your bowl in reverse like this. Okay. Well, obviously you do need a tailstock for that, so I'm going to install my tailstock. Remember to I'm not sure what you're supposed to remember to because I can't remember. So, but yes, we're going to put the tailstock back on using the hole that we registered earlier on. And because this is already flawed out, please don't push too hard with your tailstock. You might just punch right through the lathe. Okay, so this lathe has a bit of detail, which is that the tailstock needs to be further back in order for the tool rest to be in position. So I'm going to extend the tool rest even more now. I'm going to extend the tailstock even more. Hopefully we're back in center. Okay, do a hand spin and a check. Okay, very good. So of course, if your tailstock comes loose, your live center comes loose towards at this point, it's going to cause your blow to fly out. So definitely double check the centerness of your thing, okay, of your bowl. Well, not the centerness, but the tightness of your chucks. And of course, with your technique, you have to be super light at this point, because if you're going to be reckless and you're going to be heavy, it's not going to end very well for your bowl. Okay, now it's not the right time to take risks. So hopefully you can see the angle here, but I'm literally just levering against the live center's body and just pushing it in like that. And getting right to the center there. We're going to remove most of the height of the foot. So this is what I was discussing earlier on when we talk about creating bowls with very small feet. And those are done at this stage. So here is where you will make the aesthetic foot or the visual foot. Okay, which is the foot that you actually want on your bowl. At the start, the initial foot is really just for the structural component. Okay, just for the idea, the job of holding on. Okay, I'm going to bring the camera closer now even. Hopefully you can see a bit more. Okay, so I think this angle is going to be a bit better for you to see the details here, okay? So yeah, this is the visual foot, the aesthetic foot, the foot of your choice and of your design. Okay, the earlier foot was just for work holding. Don't get too obsessed about it. So I'm going to remove almost the entire foot, just short of making it footless, both for the purposes of demonstration. And also, I do like that the foot is small. Okay. So the jaw marks left behind from your chucking are removed at this stage. I'm going to reinforce the dovetail very slightly, making sure not to make the foot way too small. And we are actually doing okay. So now, our favorite thing in the world, sanding. Oops. Okay, so you can see a bit of a pale color on the top right here. This is a bit of a mistake. You actually don't want to do that. You don't want to sand larger than the area that you're working on when you are sanding your foot, so that you don't have to sand so much, but we can always sand that again. Okay, but you're supposed to keep the sanding, I was supposed to keep the sanding as small as possible. So that we don't have to redo too much of the sanding. Okay, so part of the reason why I'm demonstrating the sanding even is also to show you the details of how to hold your sandpaper. There are certain safety things that you need to work on when you are sanding so close to a piece of spinning wood. You have the significant chance of cutting yourself. And I have my elbows braced up against my body, my torso, so that I'm really just extending the legs, not my legs, but my hands just very slightly out of my body. Okay, using my left hand to support my right hand. Okay, most of the time is spent as usual on the initial grids before we go up to 120. So 80 is going to be the most of your work, and whatever you touch with 80 you have to touch with your 120. The bottom is obviously not as important. even see the wax burnishing back into the sanded areas. And now we'll go for the final grade, which is 240, which is the only grade that you will expand a bit more. So you can see I'm expanding the sanding area so that I get a little bit more coverage. You want to make sure you always overlap the sanded areas with the unsanded areas, the burnished areas with the unburnished areas. Okay, so absolutely essential. Okay, so overlapping, and then a tiny bit of beeswax, and we will be done. You can actually use the device, use the foot to just cut a groove into the beeswax, and that will help it to go inside all the way. So your beeswax, your wax block is going to be so large that it's going to be hard to get inside some of the foot areas. So what you do, you take your finger, pad up with a couple of layers of cloth. Don't use just one layer, you will burn your hand. Okay. I'm going to take my wax and apply on the corner here. Let it melt. And then I'm going to push it in with my finger. This is a little bit risky. You really might not want to do this if you are a beginner. Okay, you really have to know where your fingers are in order to keep them safe. Okay, but for me it's perfectly normal. And you're going to try and get as close to the center as possible. You're definitely going to miss the final area right where the live center is. But other than that, it should be lubricated and very waxy. Alright, finishing up. So remember not to overload the wax. Don't use the liquidness of the wax to give you the shine. Always rely on burnishing to polish out. Okay? Don't apply too much wax in each pass. This can go on forever though. If you want to go to a very high shine, where you can just keep waxing it and you will get very, very, very shiny. Okay, I'm gonna turn this off now, and ta-da! Okay. Oops. Okay, so a little bit of a bonus here. I left some marks on the interior of the bowl because of the gem chuck having some marker marks. It's a bit dirty, so what I've done, I just turned the bowl around and just chucked it on very lightly with the chuck, hopefully not to scar anything. And I'm gonna just turn it on. I'm gonna try and burnish it. Again, by first sanding, and then after that applying the wax. This is usually done with the soft jaw chuck, but I actually use my hard jaw here, the straight iron jaws. And hopefully this is a demonstration of the right of skill rather than what not to do. So using the squeeze is extremely important at this stage. Alright, that looks good. Okay, very nice. Let's see how much damage I've done. Oh, the jaws actually slipped. So I'm gonna jam chuck it again to clean up the bottom. And a bit less force. Okay, mission accomplished, I hope. Alright. So that was it. I hope this video would inspire you to pick up bow turning, whether is it as a class with us or if you got a lathe at home that you bought and you're just trying to figure things out. Hope this video helps you a lot. Feel free to ask me any questions in the comments if you want to know any more details about the bow turning process. Okay, bye bye.